Of all the major British Romantic poets, the one most studied in history, contemporary history as well as more ancient history, was Byron. As a child, he avidly read history, continued to engage in that kind of reading up through school in Harrow and finally college at Cambridge, and continued as an adult to read voraciously in historical texts. Connected to this interest in history was an interest in political affairs. If you read Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, you quickly see not only a man who is very keen on how the landscape evokes historical events, but also a man who is very interested in how current political forces are shaping the landscape, shaping society. So it's fair to say that in some ways, in some ways Wordsworth was a spatial poet. What do I mean? Well, think of Tintern Abbey. This is a man, yes, who's thinking about what happened 5 years ago, but ultimately he's very interested in the space, Tintern Abbey, and thinking about how his relationship to that space, static space, at least architecturally, can help him think about his relationship to the natural world and his relationship to his own imagination. And at a certain point in that poem, he says that since he has been to Tintern Abbey 5 years earlier, since over that 5 years he has learned something that takes him beyond the more thoughtlessness of 5 years earlier, and that he has learned of a sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused. And he goes on to talk about this idea that there's a motion and a spirit that rolls through all the things of the earth and all the thinking things of the earth. I talked in class about how this is a moment where Wordsworth is invoking an aesthetic theory currently in vogue during the Romantic Age, the sublime. In Germany, Kant in his critique of judgment, and Burke in his essay on the sublime, these are both essays from the late 18th century, both make a distinction between two kinds of aesthetic experience: an experience of the beautiful, an experience of the sublime. An experience of the beautiful is an experience that provides pleasure, that gives one a sense of harmony, symmetry, concord. Uh, in this regard, we might think of a well organized garden as beautiful, or a Shakespearean or a sonnet of Shakespeare as beautiful. Anything that suggests harmony and comfort. In contrast, we can have an aesthetic experience that is sublime. A sublime experience causes pain as much as pleasure. When I have a sublime experience, I'm encountering forces that seem to dwarf me. I may be looking at a tumultuous ocean. I can even think of some kind of natural disaster that I can view from a point of safety, like a tornado or a hurricane. Maybe I'm staring down into a huge abyss, think of the Grand Canyon, or maybe I'm just staring up into the boundlessness of space. In each of those situations, I feel tiny, I feel dwarfed, I feel insignificant. My mind tries to create a concept or an image that would correspond to the boundlessness of what I'm experiencing, but I fail to do so. And this causes pain. But at the same time, my mind senses that I'm part of these boundless energies. And this exhilarates me and ultimately makes me feel pleasure. Kant takes it a step further and says that my mind can intuit concepts like the infinite and the eternal, which go beyond nature. So ultimately, I realize even though my mind is insufficient for finding an image or a concept for these boundless experiences I'm having, there's a sense that my mind is superior because it can intuit, again, ideas that go beyond the natural world, like eternity or infinity. Now, why am I telling you all this? Wordsworth's sublime tends to be spatial, meaning it tends to imagine a poet, let's call him Wordsworth, in a particular place and thinking about how in that particular place he's partaking of some sort of ubiquitous principle. So in Tintern Abbey, he stares at Tintern Abbey, thinks about Tintern Abbey, and that opens him up to this idea that somehow he is here right now in this place, but also he is everywhere in space because he is but one of many manifestations of this motion and spirit that moves through all things. So we see Wordsworth constantly invoking particular places, not so much for their participation in an ongoing historical narrative, but more for their ability possibly to open him up, the poet up, to a sense of the infinite, the boundless, the ubiquitous right here in this place. I go into this detail to set us up for Byron's idea of the sublime, as his idea of the sublime appears at least in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. I would argue that Byron's sense of the sublime is more temporal than spatial. What do I mean? So, if we look at the first canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, we see Childe Harold touring around Portugal, and he sees all of these beautiful pieces of architecture, all these domes and towers, and they've been around a very long time. And he says that, okay, here you are, and here is where all these various seemingly important people did dwell. I'm in stanza 23. Here didst thou dwell, here schemes of pleasure plan, beneath yon mountain's ever beauteous brow. But now, as if a thing unblessed by man, thy fairy dwelling is as lone as thou. Here giant weeds a passage scarce allow to halls deserted, portals gaping wide. Fresh lessons to the thinking bosom, how vain are the pleasures on earth supplied, swept into wrecks anon by time's ungentle tide, swept into wrecks anon by time's ungentle tides. So he sees these abandoned palaces, these great houses that were once splendid and pompous, probably. Filled with life and energy, perhaps confidence, perhaps arrogance. And here they are now ruins, because that's what time does. Time is some force that extends back into the past beyond measure and will extend forward into the future beyond measure. There was a scientific theory in play during the Romantic period, put in the World by James Hutton, a geologist who was really one of the first scientists of the late 18th or 19th centuries to say that time is basically infinite. Before someone like Hutton, it was thought that the world had been around only, say, 6,000 years, or would be only 6,000 years old, based on some kind of biblical sensibility that for every day God created the world, that counts for 1,000 years. And God, it takes 6 days to create the world. Each day is 1,000 years, so Earth will be 6,000 years, and then it will end. Studying fossils, reading about fossils, Hutton says, no. We have no idea when time began. We may never know when time began, and we have no idea when time will end. Well, not that Byron was deeply studied in those scientific theories, but he does seem to have a sense that time is something that is beyond measure. And ultimately, time will lay low anything. No matter how grand something is right now, it will eventually be a ruin. So Byron goes throughout, as Childe Harold, the European landscape during the Napoleonic Wars and in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, and basically looks at all of this wreck and ruin and says, this is just how all things will end up. Time will lay everything low. Measureless, boundless time will lay everything low. And what does this lead to? Well, Byron thinks about this temporal sublime politically. The idea that no matter how powerful one is right now, say a tyrant or a king, this person will be laid low. It will be destroyed, as everything is destroyed. Nothing lasts. Nothing is permanent. Shelley writes about this theme, Percy Shelley writes about this theme in Ozymandias, where he imagines someone in a desert who sees this grand ancient Egyptian statuary that's been brought low, and as all things will be brought low and basically reduced to the desert. So this is bleak, but it's also, strangely, I think, in someone like Byron, positive, because the temporal sublime becomes a position of critique. saying that there is no one manifestation, no one proper manifestation of goodness or justice or truth. There is no one true mode of government. Basically, everything is but a brief blip on time's ungentle tides. So, this can become a position from which to criticize a corrupt monarchy. One can look at George IV, who was Prince Regent, as Byron does, critically, and say you have God on your side. You say you have eternity on your side, when you're just one of thousands or millions of people who have thought that they were right, and you will be wiped out just like everybody else is. So the temporal sublime becomes a position from which to critique corruption that tries to justify itself through some kind of permanent eternal principle. But also, there is an aesthetic to Byron's temporal sublime. What is that? There's a sense that everything in the world is a manifestation of the flow of time. Everything is a form of temporal energy, let's say. If you imagine time's ungentle tides, if you imagine time as an ocean, waves are a manifestation, vortices are a manifestation, whirlpools, eddies. There are different ways that the ocean manifests. Well, there are some forms of time superior to others. Tyrannical forms, obviously, in Byron's mind and in most people's minds, would be dangerous, inferior. But are there certain forms that try to capture the dynamism, the flexibility, the flux of time, and therefore are more appropriate to how time really is? If castles of kings say time stands still here because I am the one for all eternity and my rulership will last for all eternity, of course that's what kings try to say in some cases. Is there an aesthetic form that doesn't stand still, that is dynamic as time is dynamic, that is transient as time is transient? Well, the answer is yes. A poem like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is endlessly sort of undercutting itself. It won't allow itself to stay static. Byron's always ironizing his poems. He's always undercutting his poems. He's always deflating his poems, as if to say, my poems are working just like time works. They're undercutting, moving forward, undercutting, moving forward, undercutting, moving forward. And in this regard, the temporal sublime gives the poem power, but also there's a sense that the poem will ultimately live longer, will be livelier, more potent than, say, a castle, because it is somehow channeling the very power and grandeur of time.